name is Sarah, and I will be leading your harm reduction workshop today. Let me just play around here so I can share my screen with you. Okay. So, like I said, we're going to be here talking about harm reduction today and, of course, the ways in which it relates to cannabis-impaired driving. Before we begin, would anybody like to do a land acknowledgement?
I should have prepared mine.
Not to worry, I have one prepared.
Do you have one prepared? Okay, perfect, good.
So this lovely picture is of the city of Hamilton where I reside. I'm not going to tell you which one, but you can actually see my apartment building in this picture. So the city of Hamilton is situated upon the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas. This land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Ashinabek to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. We further acknowledge that this land is covered by the Between Lakes Purchase, 1792, between the Crown and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Today, the city of Hamilton is home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we recognize that we must do more to learn about the rich history of this land so that we can better understand our roles as residents, neighbors, parents, and caretakers. So thank you. All right, this is our agenda for the day. We will be going over principles of harm reduction and cannabis, cannabis and youth, cannabis impaired driving, and following this, we're really going to work on the applications of harm reduction. So following all the information, you will be given a short quiz to test what you've learned. And really my hope for you is that you're leaving this workshop feeling confident in your knowledge of harm reduction principles and interventions, as well as your ability to really apply these approaches while facilitating the weed out the risk material. So moving forward, just so everybody is on the same page, you will require a pen and paper for the workshop, both to take notes if desired, and for the activities that we will be doing as well, okay? So who the heck am I? So my name is Sarah Bell. I received my Bachelor of Arts in the Sociology of Health and Aging from Western University and went on to complete a postgrad certificate in addictions and mental health. So during this time, I was able to take courses on substance use and dependency, holistic treatments, motivational interviewing, and trauma-informed practices, among many others. And these courses really worked to equip me with the foundation to enter the field. And since then, I've worked with CMHA, the Reach Out Center for Kids, the Career Foundation, Hamilton Halton Learning Disabilities Association, and of course, Springboard's Weed Out the Risk program. I've developed and facilitated over 100 hours of original workshop content with topics covering mental health and wellness, eating disorder prevention, harm reduction, cannabis education, and employment. Regardless of what I'm conducting the workshop on, I am adamant about ensuring that all content is delivered compassionately through a trauma-informed, anti-oppressive, strengths-based lens. So, we're gonna get started. We're gonna warm up with a little activity. So this activity is called the Circle of Trust. So you will need your pen and paper for this. So in a moment, I will ask you to think of and write down the names of 6 to 8 people in your life, excluding family members who are within your inner circle, your circle of trust. Okay, so again, 6 to 8 people, not including family, that are within your circle of trust. Okay, so I'll give you a moment to go ahead and write down those people. Okay. It might be hard to think of 6 to 8 people that you've been interacting outside of your family since COVID, but put your brain to the test. We can think back to 2019.
Yeah, this has never been so hard.
It was like, I see one person and it's my partner, so.
Yeah.
All right, so now when you are ready, when you've had your list, I'm going to ask you to put a check mark beside each person who you share the following with. So to make it nice and easy for you, I have put these criteria up on the screen. You'll be able to see them, but I'll also go through them with you. So we're going to put a check next to each person who you share the same age with, gender identity, race, religion, ethnicity or nationality, language, ability, professional background, educational background, and neighborhood. So I'll give you a moment to do that. I know there's quite a few to get through. So if somebody just wants to give me a sign that you're done, then we can move on to the next part.
I'm done.
You're done? Okay.
Yeah, I'm done too.
Perfect. Okay. So now that we have our list in front of us, we have our series of check marks. I'll just ask you to review. What are we noticing about our list? Does anybody want to share?
In my friend circle, there's a lot of similarities. Now that I've checked it off, we're all around the same age. There's male and female in my friend group, but we're the same race, religion, not ethnicity and nationality, but we have a lot of similarities is what I'm finding. I thought there'd be more diversity, but now that I've checked it off, not so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Does anybody else want to share what their list looks like?
Yeah, I'm in the same boat too. A lot of similar ages. Almost everything is pretty similar.
So what this really is demonstrating, this activity illustrates our affinity for those most like ourselves, those whom we share similar identities with. The idea of identity and behavior in relation to social groups is the basis of social identity theory. So this theory states that there are in-groups and there are out-groups. In-groups are people who are most like us, so people on that list who have check marks next to them, who share the same reference as to what is normal with us. So that in turn is reinforcing a positive sense of identity. Outgroups, on the other hand, are those who are not like us. We are not typically taught how to socialize with members of this group, with members of outgroups, and we may even feel uncomfortable in their presence. Outgroup behavior disrupts our sense of what's normal. So I will ask you, what group are you a part of right now? When you're facilitating, how do you interact with people outside of your group? So when you are facilitating, you are, to the students, very likely part of an outgroup because you are the outsider coming in, spewing all this information at us. They're going to be considering you somebody in an outgroup. And we really want to be considering how we're interacting with those outside of our groups. How are you showing up for people with different life experiences than you? How are you holding space for them? And that brings us to implicit bias. And implicit bias are the attitudes and beliefs that people may be unwilling to or unable to report. It's very important to consider the biases you hold towards cannabis and those who use cannabis or drugs in general. Decades of prohibition, propaganda, and highly politicized anti-cannabis research has left many people with a bad taste in their mouths. There's a lot of drug-related stigma. When you are presenting to students about cannabis and there's a confliction between your views and the information that you're presenting, this results in cognitive dissonance, which is going to affect your ability to present the material in a neutral manner. Okay, so really, as you are considering this, I would encourage you to ask yourself, what is my experience with cannabis? Why did I apply for this role? And am I overtly positive or overtly negative about cannabis? And we know that implicit bias is oftentimes expressed through language. So there are lots of, terms, slang for people who do consume cannabis: stoner, burnout, pothead. All are terms with negative connotations, and they express bias towards cannabis use and those who use. So as we delve into the workshop today, we really come to learn that harm reduction is really all about having respect for people who use drugs, and that does include the language that we use to describe them. So I will open it up. What do we think of when we hear harm reduction?
For me, it just sounds like a gentler approach, some more compassion to how you're speaking. You're more focused on helping. It sounds more helpful than focused on making you feel bad for your habit, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that. It's a gentler approach. Perfect. So here we have the principles of harm reduction as outlined by CAMH. And CAMH says that it's built upon 3 principles. The first is pragmatism. So a harm reduction approach recognizes that substance use is inevitable in society and that it is necessary to take a public health-oriented response to minimize potential harms. The second is humane values. So individual choice is considered and judgment is not placed on people who use substances. The dignity of people who use substances is respected. Those who use are exercising autonomy and those who do not use are exercising autonomy. We must equally respect both choices. And lastly, we have a focus on harms. So an individual's substance use is secondary to the potential harms that may result from that use. We are not concerning ourselves with the fact that somebody is using, we're concerning ourselves with the potential harms that an individual may face as a result of using. So where is the controversy? Because a lot of times when you do bring up harm reduction, there are some naysayers. Harm reduction is a public health approach that rethinks what success is for people who use drugs and does not mandate abstinence as a requirement for compassionate care. Support is not contingent on abstinence, and we really do see a shift away from assumed morality and abstinence or fear and punishment. It used to be that in order to receive treatment for substance use, you had to remain abstinent for the duration of the treatment or be removed from the program. This sort of zero tolerance perspective on drugs views harm reduction as an approach that encourages drug use or, supports the legalization of all drugs. But it's interesting because few would object to the use of nicotine patches or masks, whereas supervised injection sites often evoke strong reactions. The key issue then is not whether, harm reduction is good or bad, but rather the extent to which we are able to accept interventions, supports, and services for dealing with problems related to drug use and abuse. Harm reduction does not attempt to minimize or ignore the real and tragic harm and danger associated with substance use. Instead, it acknowledges this truth and equips individuals with tools and strategies to use in a safer way. Okay. So as seen in this graphic from CMHA, substance use exists along a spectrum ranging from abstinence and beneficial use to chronic dependency. Now, it is important to acknowledge that it's very common for one person to experience various stages along the spectrum throughout their lives, as substance use and dependency are rarely linear. As such, harm reduction includes a spectrum of interventions, such as less risky use, managed use, abstinence, and ultimately meeting people who use drugs where they're at. Harm reduction follows the belief that society benefits most when drug policy is designed to help people who use drugs live better lives, rather than punish them. This approach ensures that those who actively use, as well as those with a history of use, have a meaningful voice in the creation of programs and policies designed to serve them. These principles act to empower those who use substances by recognizing users as the primary agents of their lives, and therefore the primary agents in affecting change related to their use. It also empowers those who use to share information and resources amongst their community so that the most pertinent and meaningful resources are reaching the target audience. As a result, Harm reduction principles and interventions really do lead to increased community resilience because members are supporting each other, providing resource for each other, and really helping to determine the services that are most appropriate for them. Change is really in the hands of the community and the people who do use substances. Because
Sarah, can I ask a question?
absolutely.
So what about youth? There's a lot of people that think that there's some youth that just need a real top-down approach. They really need to be told, how exactly, like the consequences of using and things like that. And these scare tactics will be effective for them. What would you say in those situations? Like there's some youth who just need the scare tactics.
Yeah, absolutely. I would argue that the scare tactic shuts down dialogue, and it really prevents productive conversation from happening about drug use. You know, if all you are presenting the youth with is anti-cannabis, stay away from drugs, this is your brain on drugs, then the student who is experiencing, maybe issues with their substance use or is looking to find more information rather for themselves or for a family member, what have you, that's discouraging the conversation from happening. We know that youth are going to experiment, youth are going to use, we'll get to it in a little bit, we'll talk about youth and cannabis more, but I would say that anti-drug, all drugs are bad approach really just does more harm than good because it's shutting down important conversations.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Thank you for your question. Okay. So, because harm reduction demands that interventions and policies reflect the specific needs of the community, there is no universal definition or formula for implementing harm reduction. It's dynamic, it's ever-changing, and it's going to meet the needs of the direct community that it serves. Each model is going to look different. We also know that this approach offers healing to communities as it acknowledges that substance use and dependency are largely a product of trauma related to social inequalities such as poverty, racism, and sex-based discrimination, to name a few. These barriers in turn affect both people's vulnerability to and capacity for effectively dealing with drug-related harm. So we'll get into the interventions. When we talk about harm reduction interventions, we really can break it down into 3 levels. So the first, macro. This is the philosophical and political movement focused on shifting power and resources to people who are most vulnerable to structural violence. So this is really the change on the societal level. This is the shift. Then we get into the meso level. And this approach, this is the approach and fundamental beliefs and how to provide these services. So this is focusing on, the change within institutions, communities, and groups, the framework. And then we have our micro level interventions, which are the tools and services used to reduce potential harm. These micro level interventions focus on individuals and small groups. This is the front line, the ground level. This is interacting with people who use drugs and providing them with tools. Now, whatever label is used to describe these types of programs, interventions, each should be assessed in terms of its effectiveness in reducing negative impacts of high-risk situations or behaviors on the individual, the community, and the society at large. All right, we'll get into the good stuff. So, harm reduction in cannabis. When we talk about cannabis and harm reduction, it is very important to note that cannabis use in itself is a form of harm reduction. With the recent opioid crisis, it has become even more important to give people options for pain relief. Prescription painkillers are highly addictive and are prescribed in larger doses than they should be, more often than they should be. It's very easy for someone's body to become dependent on these substances, and legalizing cannabis leads to fewer opioid prescriptions being issued, which of course results in fewer opioid-related overdoses. This has become even more of a concern in the midst of COVID-19 with everyone quarantining and isolating. The dangers associated with substance use are greatly heightened when an individual uses alone because there's nobody there in case of emergency. But I digress. The Cannabis Act, which was introduced in 2018, has 3 main public health goals. And the first is to keep cannabis out of the hands of youth. Even though it's a stated target of legalization, realistically, we know that we won't be able to keep cannabis out of the hands of youth. Youth are going to use and experiment with cannabis. It's inevitable, whether it's for, recreational or therapeutic reasons. Talking to youth about cannabis will not increase the chances of them experimenting with it. It is our job to acknowledge this and provide youth with the information and resources that they need to use cannabis in a less risky and informed way. This is very important because we know that 26% of Canadian youth between the ages of 15 to 24 are cannabis consumers. Your prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for risk assessment, memory, attention, planning, and problem solving, does not finish developing until the age of 25. So people within this 15 to 24 age group, they're taking more risks. They're less likely to have foresight into planning an evening home. They are more likely to drive under the influence and to make other such choices without critical thought. Preparing youth with resources and information through a harm reduction lens acknowledges the autonomy of youth and allows them to make informed decisions regarding their health and safety. Now, whether due to financial restrictions, age restrictions, or loyalty to a legacy market entrepreneur, we know that 52% of youth aged 15 to 24 are more likely to purchase cannabis from an illegal source. Much of the work of the legalized market is focused on appropriate marketing, health warnings, and labels to really educate buyers on products that they're consuming. So for example, strict regulations are in place down to the exact shade of yellow used for the warning labels. Labels also include a breakdown of the CBD to THC ratios in the product, though percent of THC is not always the best indicator of how a product will affect a user. This information may be prudent for those with less experience with cannabis, and it can serve as a guide for where to begin. As the cannabis industry continues to mature, strains and dosages will become more and more reliable. The legacy market does not have the capacity to ensure reliability and dosage in this same way. So if over half of youth are more likely to purchase cannabis from an illegal source, then over half of youth are truly uneducated on the product they are consuming and therefore are unaware of the risks that they're taking.
Okay. Sarah, I've seen there's like some of the illegal stores that are around in Canada, they do have the percentages. Are those reliable, or should people only really trust the government regulated stores?
I would suggest only trusting the government regulation stores. As somebody who has, a little bit of insight into the cannabis industry, I can tell you that even legalized products, if you were to buy the same strain from week to week, that is going to be a different product. So, even if you can't even trust that the reliability of products we're getting nowadays are going to be consistent from time to time, I really would not rely on information on the labels of, the non-legalized products. Okay. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so the Center for Addiction and Mental Health has identified the following 10 measures for reducing harms associated with cannabis use. So I'm not going to go too deep into these because we do have lots to cover, but the very first is start low and go slow. So we all have a story about a friend who took an edible, grew impatient waiting for the effects to kick in, took more of the edible, and then was an absolute goner because they were too high. This is what we're trying to avoid. We want to encourage youth to start with lower doses of cannabis and, if desired, gradually consume more so that the body has time to adjust. It's better to not have taken enough and have to take a bit more than to have taken too much and have to ride it out. Consider appropriate time and place. So the cool parents who always said, if you're going to drink, drink at home, they had the right idea. Setting and mental space going into drug use really can have an impact on the type of high you experience. So you want to make sure that you feel safe, are with people that you trust, and of course don't have any deadlines or appointments coming up that you need to meet. All right, we want to be choosing less risky cannabis products. So I'll flip ahead to this graphic. This is from the Ontario Cannabis Store, and it's a great outline of THC compared to CBD. An easy way to think about it is that THC is producing the intoxicating effect, and CBD produces a therapeutic effect and does not intoxicate you. CBD and THC both bind to cannabinoid receptors. So when somebody consumes a CBD dominant product, it means that fewer THC cannabinoids are binding, which means that the effects are less intense. So if you have a higher CBD to THC ratio, the CBD can really inhibit the full effects of THC. I always encourage, mixing a little CBD with the THC, make a little cocktail if you'd like, just to ensure that, we're not overwhelming our systems. Okay, and we want to choose safer methods and less risky methods of cannabis consumption. So smoking itself would be considered the most harmful method of consumption because the mouth, throat, and lungs are exposed to the chemicals present within the smoke. Vaping would be a less harmful alternative to smoking, and taking an edible would be considered an even safer method to that because there's a standardized dosage per item. But even so, edibles are going to affect you in different ways depending on who you are. Okay, so harm reduction for edibles would be ensuring that you are taking clearly marked edibles, outlining the dosage versus somebody who's, just baked a bunch at home. Who knows how much weed they put in it, who knows where that weed was from. And we want to be using, again, products with higher CBD ratios to THC as a good practice. Okay, so smoking, we know.
Sarah, I just have one other question for you. I don't even know if you can answer it because it's kind of a tough one. It's kind of going back towards like the first question, first point you put up there about like providing a safe space for youth, for parents who say, for example, like if you're going to choose to drink, use the house kind of idea, like, yeah, considering appropriate time and place. But what's the balance for like a parent or an educator when they want to not also like bring in the idea, like they want to put out the idea of having a safe option, but then they also don't even want to plant that seed of idea in a youth's mind that they could drink or smoke?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the best way to sort of open up that dialogue is to do so not in relation to the person at hand. So, if you were a parent or an educator looking to speak to your student or child, I wouldn't approach it being like, hey, have you ever smoked before? Are you interested in drinking? I would probably ask it in a way where, oh, so you're getting into high school, you're getting into middle school. I know back when I was your age, people started experimenting around that time. What's it like for you? Has anybody been experimenting? And just sort of gauge in that way. We know that talking to youth about cannabis or about substance use in general is not going to encourage them or increase their likelihood of experimenting. We just want to be able to present them with information and again, be able to engage in a dialogue with them. So if you are shutting down the idea of them, using cannabis even before they've brought it up to you, then they're not going to feel safe to come to you should they have any questions or concerns.
That's really interesting what you're saying about bringing up the idea of cannabis doesn't exactly plant the seed, because I guess they're already seeing it in so many other ways, right? Like that idea could already be brought in from so many other things in their environment that you providing a safe space isn't going to be the instigator of deciding to use or not.
Absolutely. Yes, that's wonderful, Sylvia. Thank you for bringing that up. We know that the conversations, especially with youth, are happening elsewhere, and you're not going to be the first point of contact to introduce that concept to them. And if you are, then you're able to present them with useful information. But we do want to be having important conversations and being able to portray factual information, and creating a safe space is very important. Okay, so I think I'll just skip ahead here, find where we were. Okay. Okay, so we want to be utilizing safer smoking practices. So We do not want to be breathing deep into our lungs. We do not want to be holding it for a long time deep in our lungs. We want to protect the lungs at all costs. So even vaping cannabis is going to be a better alternative. Okay, we want to reduce the amount of cannabis used and how frequently it is used. So really we can talk to youth about cannabis being a double-edged sword. Do you control your use of cannabis, or is it controlling you? You know, I would encourage people to take into account how often am I smoking? Why am I smoking this often? What is it doing for me? We want to encourage youth to be taking breaks and avoiding high frequency of use. High frequency would be daily or near daily cannabis use, because we know that it may lead to long-term health risks. And of course, our brains aren't fully developed until the age of 25. So again, I would ask youth to consider their use. Are they using daily, weekly, and what does that mean for them? We want to avoid synthetic cannabis altogether. So synthetic cannabis goes by a couple names, fake weed, K2, spice, black mamba, you name it, there's lots of different names. We know that humans and animals have an endocannabinoid system, and that cannabis contains cannabinoids that light up this system in our bodies. So labs have created synthetic cannabis, which is plant matter that's been sprayed with a cocktail of chemicals that mimic the cannabinoids that our body is receptive to. However, you never know what cannabinoid you're going to get. And the chemicals attach to those receptors more intensely than THC even does, which can lead to stronger effects. The resulting effects can be unpredictable and dangerous. Synthetic products such as K2 and spice are generally associated with even more adverse health outcomes, such as, extreme anxiety, hallucinations, feeling confused, violent behavior, even suicidal thoughts. So we do want to make sure that if any message we're getting across, we want to be staying away from synthetic cannabis altogether. A good way to know a good way to distinguish between synthetic cannabis and cannabis is that when you are purchasing cannabis, it'll typically be presented in the buds and the flowers. If you are purchasing synthetic cannabis, it'll likely be in a bag, all ground up already. That should be your first question. Okay. We want to avoid mixing cannabis with tobacco and alcohol. We want to encourage youth to stick to one substance at a time. Additional substances will further impairment, and mixing substances should be discouraged as a whole, as different substances really do interact with the body in different ways, causing varying effects on the bodies, ranging from the spins to repression of the respiratory system, which can lead to death. We really would like to consider our risk profile and avoid cannabis if we are pregnant. And we also want to be considering our age, our sex, and our family history, okay? So we know that if you have a family history of substance use or mental illness, such as psychosis, you are more susceptible to experience these onset symptoms as a result of cannabis use. Okay. And then lastly, and perhaps most importantly, we want to, encourage youth not to operate a vehicle while impaired. We want to have a plan before using. And it's important to distinguish that you will be facilitating workshops to youth across Canada. So different modes of transportation are going to be more common in different regions of the country. Be that a car, a boat, or a snowmobile. Okay. So let's get down into the nitty gritty. Let's learn about how we're actually going to be applying harm reduction and what we're learning. So this graphic here is a very effective tool from the Harm Reduction Coalition. When we approach a situation such as cannabis impaired driving through a harm reduction lens, we consider the risk, mindset, and setting specific to the situation and person involved. This will help inform next steps and ensure that we are reducing risks where possible to the individual themselves and peripherally as well. So we'll go ahead and apply it to cannabis impaired driving. So we know that Weed Out the Risk emphasizes the legal, financial, and social risks associated with cannabis impaired driving. So great questions to be asking yourselves when considering and assessing risk. What issue is being presented? What other possible sources of harm may be connected to the main issue? Are there multiple substances being used? Okay. We know that cannabis impaired driving is a choice and that there are many points prior to getting in a vehicle to choose differently. We can consider the mindset of the individual and ask ourselves the following questions to gauge their state of being and determine what is leading them towards the choice of driving. We want to know, how are they acting? How are they feeling? What are they thinking? What is the urgency of being in the car right now? Why do they want to be driving? Where are we going? These are all important things to consider. Okay, and when considering setting, we can explore the following. Is anybody else in the car with you? Is there a gas station coming up that you can pull into? Are the roads busy? Is there somebody else with you that can drive that is not impaired? Are there pedestrians around? So this risk mindset setting framework is a practical place to begin when considering how to best reduce harms in a given moment. These questions can open the dialogue around someone's decision to drive while impaired and may prove to be successful in intervening. Okay, so again, we really want to be sure that when we're going out and conducting our workshops, we are confident in the dialogue that we can use to help prevent cannabis impaired driving. So does anybody have any prompts that they like to use? No problem, I have a whole list. Okay, so these are a couple that I have come up with, again, to prevent cannabis impaired driving from even happening in the first place. And, you know, these are all unfortunately tried, tested statements. And the one thing I do like to point out is that a lot of them, you know, take the onus on yourself. So I would be more comfortable if I don't support, I love you too much to let you, right? You are reducing the harm and the feeling of that person being attacked potentially in that moment, but also encouraging dialogue to happen at all. Okay. We also have some dialogue to respond. So should we get to a place where this choice has been made, what prompts can we use as the passenger to kind of respond to this situation and reduce harm? Okay, so I appreciate you wanting to take me blank, but the story that I'm telling myself is that, can we pull over here quickly? This doesn't feel right. I'm not comfortable right now. I don't know if either of us are okay to be driving. So after looking at these, you know, dialogue to prevent and dialogue to respond, are there any that are standing out for you?
For me, it's the I'm not comfortable right now, because that's just the easiest one for me to say. And then I can kind of lead you to a different decision from there. Just expressing my discomfort, I think, kind of raises people's ears. So I'd probably go with that one.
Thank you. Yeah, awesome. One that I really do like from the list is the story that I'm telling myself, because you are then able to be completely honest in that moment. You know, the story that I'm telling myself is that we're in this car, you are impaired, and we're going to get in an accident. That's the story I'm telling myself. Let's end this story and write a new one. Okay. So while facilitating, we understand that there are members of the audience who may have a medical prescription to cannabis, may choose to use recreationally, or may have family members in the industry. We shouldn't be overtly for or against cannabis, and we should provide evidence-based information so as to not reinforce the stigmatization of cannabis use. And this really does go back to, you know, our choice of language when facilitating. How are we referring to somebody who uses cannabis, and what messages are we conveying? So while facilitating, I would encourage you to think of the following. How are you responding to the specifics of each workshop, of each personal story? What is your internal response? What is your external response? And how are you navigating those? When we are facilitating, we want to, whenever possible, create safety and a level of predictability. So this can be done through deliberate choices, such as sharing an agenda ahead of time, scheduling breaks, etc. We don't ever want to assume lived experience. We don't want to assume aspects of somebody's identity. We don't know anybody else's story. We only know our own. And if a question is asked that you don't know the factual answer to, it's okay to say that. We can always offer to find the answer following the presentation when appropriate, but it is not your responsibility to provide definitives to each question posed by the audience. Okay, so I do want to change the pace here and really work on that application piece. So we're going to be discussing some difficult situations or scenarios that may be encountered during facilitation so that we can be prepared when they happen. When we're taken off guard or do not have time to consciously or critically respond to something, we are more likely to misspeak or conduct ourselves in a way that is out of integrity with a harm reduction approach. With that being said, I have 3 scenarios to present you with. So I'm going to read them out to you one by one. I will have you individually consider what you would do in this situation through a harm reduction lens, and then we will discuss together, okay? Okay, scenario number 1, and I would encourage you to write down some notes so that you're able to remember what this scenario is after. Okay, so scenario 1, a student shares that they have driven high 1,000,000 times and nothing bad has ever happened. In fact, they consider themselves to be a better driver after using cannabis products. Okay, so like I said, I'm going to give you a couple minutes to just jot down what you would do in this situation, and then we'll work through them together, okay? So just one more time, a student shares they have driven high 1,000,000 times and nothing bad has ever happened. In fact, they consider themselves to be a better driver after using cannabis products. I hear some rustling. Is somebody willing to share their answers?
I would ask why they feel like they're a better driver. Is it that they have tunnel vision and they feel like they're more focused? I would want that understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. So just open it up again. Okay. Anybody else?
Yeah, I would want to find out why they felt that way, but also kind of not push back against it. But I feel like that's how we feel with a lot of substances that we try. So say you drink as well, right? People tend to feel that they're better dancers when they're drinking, or you tend to kind of see your skill level higher when you're on a substance. So even though you may feel that you're doing better, you probably are not. You know, it's just that the effect of what you're on is making you feel that you're doing great, but in actuality, you're probably causing a lot of harm. I'll just kind of remind them that they are on something that alters what they're feeling. So your feelings are not really the truth in that moment, you know?
Absolutely. Thank you. I love the comparison to drinking and dancing. That is wonderful.
And just dovetailing on that,
Yeah.
I think I would definitely focus on the impairment and how, you know, cannabis does impair, right? And have the youth really, or the student really look at, you know, that decision for themselves, right? So again, putting the empowerment and the onus on them to make better decisions, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, we know that cannabis impaired driving is a choice. So every time that you've been doing that, the 1,000,000 times that you've driven high, you've made that choice. Let's learn a little bit more about that. What's led you to that decision? So if I were presented with that situation within a workshop, I would exactly do what you mentioned. I would get them to, you know, really expand upon why they feel that they're a better driver. And Sylvia, you did mention, perhaps it's the tunnel vision or, increased concentration. So, especially we know that THC and CBD, they work to reduce stress and anxiety. So lots of people who do consume cannabis, they think that they're a better driver when they are impaired. Lots of people think this because they're maybe a cautious driver or a slower driver, but studies show that cannabis can have a negative impact on driving by reducing concentration and attention span, slowing reaction time, and altering perception of time and distance. Driving studies, both simulated and on road, showed that drivers had increased variability in lane position, following distance, and following speed after cannabis use. Cannabis also affects the driver's ability to react to unexpected events, such as a sudden brake or a biker or a pedestrian walking onto the road. So I would say, I'm happy that nothing bad has happened to you yet, but we know that over half of cannabis impaired drivers think that it's safe to do so. The crash statistics speak otherwise. The second point within that I would address within this is that the decision to drive high because you've driven high without consequence in the past is a mental shortcut that the brain is taking, or what is known as a heuristic. In that moment, you are likely not pausing to consider the financial, legal, and social risks associated with impaired driving. So while heuristics can speed up our problem and decision-making process, they can also introduce errors. Just because something has worked in the past does not mean that it will work again. Relying on these mental shortcuts really limit our ability to be critical about our decisions, and it makes it difficult for us to even consider alternatives. Okay, on to scenario 2. So an audience member states that they do not believe in the harm reduction method, and they don't think that we should be encouraging drug use. Okay, so I'll give you a moment again to just jot down your response to this, and then I will share mine.
Sorry, could you repeat it one more time?
Yes, absolutely. So an audience member states that they do not believe in the harm reduction method, and they don't think that we should be encouraging drug use.
Is this a youth audience member or an adult audience member?
I would say it doesn't matter.
Okay.
Okay, and again, when somebody is prepared to share their response, I welcome it.
Okay. I feel like answering this question would be a little difficult, but I would say that we're not promoting drug use. Like that's not what we're doing. People are using cannabis regardless if we have the conversation or not, right? It's something that is happening. And so all we're trying to do is make sure that if they're making these decisions, they're educated decisions. Mm-hmm. They have the information, they know the risks that they're taking, they fully understand what they're partaking in. So it's not promoting them to use cannabis, but if they're using it, it's better to make informed decisions than to run the risk of not knowing and then them hurting themselves because they just didn't know.
Wonderful. I love that response. Does anybody else want to share what they have?
Obviously, with Weed Out the Risk, our focus isn't on promoting. So right off the bat, I'd want to make that clear. And I'd want to ask them, what is it that we're saying that to them sounds like we're encouraging use?
Okay, yeah. Wonderful. Yeah, there's lots of different ways that you can respond, and you raised a good point earlier. Maybe it's going to depend on whether we're responding to, an adult member of the audience or a youth member of the audience. But I would first thank them for sharing their perspective because, again, it really does open that dialogue. And I always appreciate the opportunity to explore that further. And I would share with them, harm reduction advocates for compassionate care, services, and interventions for people who use drugs, not because we're encouraging drug use, but because we recognize drug use as an inevitable, multifaceted aspect of society and recognize people who use drugs as deserving of respect. Harm reduction isn't just one thing. It can include prevention, education, cessation, treatment, counseling. We are not encouraging drug use. We are meeting people where they're at and making it as safe as possible for them to be there. So we'll hop on to scenario 3. A student begins to share a detailed story about their experiences with cannabis and law enforcement. Okay, again, a student begins to share a detailed story about their experiences with cannabis and law enforcement. So take a minute, write down what you would do in that situation, and then we'll open it up.
I'm good. The detail part of it makes me a little nervous, just because you don't know who you're triggering within the space that we're holding. So I would probably ask them to pause, let them know that they are safe to tell us their story. We're really excited to hear their experience, but to try to minimize the details, just because we are talking about law enforcement, and it does trigger in different cultural circles, different feelings, and different memories come up for people in regards to law enforcement. So telling the story, of course, but just being mindful to leave out some details just to keep it a safe space for everyone to remain feeling comfortable.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yes. Does anybody else want to add their points?
Should I be nervous about students sharing stories of use, especially if it's done in a way that sounds like they're glorifying the use? That kind of makes me nervous in a presentation.
Yeah, I would relate that back to the previous scenario that we dealt with. Just because that was your experience doesn't mean that can apply to everybody else. We want to It's difficult, right? Because we want our students to be able to share and be able to enrich the workshop and the facilitation that's going on, and peer learning is going to help with that. What I would do, and it was raised earlier, I would really work to be creating a safe space. So if that includes a preface before, a question period, we want to keep things appropriate. We want to be mindful of different experiences with cannabis and law enforcement, knowing that it is a very, prohibition was very racialized. But in this situation, I would absolutely, where applicable, let the student have the floor to tell their story, because we really do want to encourage peer learning as an aspect of the Weed Out the Risk workshops. We are not asking the student how they know what they know. We will thank them for sharing this personal story, for enriching the workshop, and we also will thank the audience for creating an environment in which that person felt comfortable enough to share. We also want to be reminding the audience that stories shared within this space shall remain within this space, and allow this dialogue where appropriate to open up conversation. You don't know what that will lead to. Perhaps another student asks a question in relation to that, or shares another relevant experience that enriches the conversation. We don't want to shut it down. We don't want to shy away from it. It's definitely okay to be nervous. I think that's your gut reaction, to be nervous, because we don't know how detailed the story is going to get. But we have to be, mindful, again, that everybody has different experiences with cannabis and law enforcement, and really work where possible to lay the foundation of having a safe space before we even open the field for questions.
Sarah, would you say it's safe to say that, after we've created that safety in the room and the safe space and all that good stuff, that, we'd want to perhaps explore what could have happened or what were the risks that were taken during that story? Is that something that we think about exploring?
Yeah, you know, I think that there's definitely opportunity again to build upon that story. So where Sylvia mentioned, you know, perhaps they were driving impaired and they were pulled over and they did get away with it. So thank you for sharing that, because let's explore what would have happened if you hadn't gotten away with it. Let's explore what those social, financial, and social financial risks are that you're going to experience when that happens. So I think that, you know, that's a great point. We definitely can use that to expand upon the conversation and explore what could have happened, what maybe, you know, is going to happen to somebody else in that situation. We never know, right? Okay. So we are going to do another activity now. So hopefully you were able to write down little jot notes of what each scenario was. I'll read them again for you as well. But what I'm going to have you do is really reflect on the scenarios that we just examined. And you're going to rank these scenarios from number 1 to number 3, from the situation that you're most comfortable with to the situation that you are the least comfortable with, okay? So just so that we are all on the same page, I'll read out our scenarios once more, and then you will be able to go ahead and rank them, okay? So scenario 1, a student shares that they have driven high 1,000,000 times and nothing bad has ever happened. In fact, they consider themselves to be a better driver after using cannabis products. Scenario 2, an audience member states that they do not believe in the harm reduction method and they don't think that we should be encouraging drug use. Okay, and lastly, a student begins to share a detailed story about their experience with cannabis and law enforcement. Okay, so those are your 3 scenarios. Again, I'm going to have you rank them from 1 to 3. 1 is the one you're most comfortable with. 3 is the one you're the least comfortable with. And I'm going to open it up now. You don't necessarily have to, you know, speak to your selection, but what is making this least comfortable situation so unbearable for you?
I can speak to the audience member scenario. I have been in that scenario and had audience members pretty much go against the harm reduction principles that we were employing. And the reason it's an uncomfortable situation is because of the 3 scenarios. It's the one that's likely to come from an adult or another professional in the room, right? Who have their own ways, and they tend to be set in them, and their mind is made up. So having conversation can sometimes be a bit sticky, right? Whereas with youth, it tends to be a bit more fluid, and there's a little bit more leeway in terms of how the conversation can go. So that's just for me in terms of what would be the most uncomfortable for me.
Thank you for sharing. Perfect. Does anybody else want to share what makes the least comfortable situation so unbearable for you?
For me, it's a 3-2-1. So the one that I'm most uncomfortable with is the student feeling as though they're better driving high, just because I feel in the past where I've had experiences with youth and they have a firm feeling that they are the exception, it's kind of a harder conversation sometimes to have, to convince them that they've been lucky in the past, but their luck may run out one day, and so that conversation for me sometimes is difficult because there's some pushback that they feel that they're kind of invincible just because they haven't had a bad experience just yet.
Absolutely. And because we know that their problem solving aspect of their brain hasn't fully developed yet.
Exactly.
Okay. Who would like to go next?
Yes, I totally agree with that. Every youth believes that they're the exception, and risk assessment can be really hard for someone in that mindset. And there's this perception versus science when it comes to driving high, and resistance when they believe something to be true, and then we're there to say, actually, science is saying that's not quite right.
Absolutely. Yeah, it can create resistance for sure. We don't want to have a stranger coming in and telling us that things that we've been doing have been wrong and that they're dangerous, but we really do want to be able to, yeah, exactly, show them that they've been lucky. They've been lucky and maybe they're not going to be so lucky next time. Perfect. Okay, and then I think one more person, if you're able to share your ranking, that would be wonderful.
I think mine is a little different. Mine would be, I'm thinking of Indigenous youth, so mine would be talking about the law enforcement part, because sometimes they can get into really heated details, and so I don't know, I would have to try to nip that in the butt right away. I guess I would use absolutely the content, and then falling down to, like chatting about it and then using a video, maybe even revisiting one of the videos from the slides that says, this is what could happen. Maybe it didn't happen to you, but yeah, that would be the one that would be the most challenging for me.
Wonderful. Thank you everyone for sharing. And I know, going through that list, we have the situation we're most comfortable with and the situation we're least comfortable with. And what we want to consider here is, with that least comfortable situation, what are we really shying away from? What is that ick that we are feeling, that we are trying to distance ourselves from, right? And the more that we do that and the more that we address that ick, the more prepared we're going to be should that scenario happen. Okay, so at this time, I would invite you to ask any questions that you have at this point. We can go over any other, practice scenarios to review through a harm reduction lens. I'll open it up to the floor.
I did have one question. You had said that I think it was vaping. Vaping is better than smoking. I believe it was. That is better than. I've heard the contrary, that vaping is really bad for you. So I was just wondering if you could expand a little bit more on why that would be a better alternative, or just like what the difference is in how it affects you.
For sure. I don't have all of the information right in front of me to answer that question to the best of my ability that I would like to. But I know with vaping, a lot of the times, with smoking, a lot of the times there's additional chemicals within the papers. There's lots of different organs that are being affected through that method. Let me follow up about that and do some more research, and I can get you the facts. If you're hearing the contrary, then let's definitely explore that.
Okay, I just wanted to see if it was something I just had heard.
Yeah.
Yeah, Desiree, I think one of the other big pieces is the temperature piece of, smoking, temperatures upwards of 380 degrees plus, and, whereas vaping, things can tend to come in under 200 in terms of how you vape, right? So that damage will be quite different to the throat, lungs, and the sort of oral cavity, as Sarah mentioned earlier, right? So that's one of the big pieces with that as well. And then
okay.
I think
that makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm. One of the things with vaping is a lot of folks tend to be mixing what's in the vape with other chemicals, with glycerin and things of that nature.
Thank you.
Okay, that makes sense.
Good thing we have such knowledgeable people on this call today. Thank you, Barrington. All right, do we have any other questions? What are some other scenarios that maybe you have been posed with that have made you felt uncomfortable?
What about when, this is something that happens often. Our facilitators are asked if they smoke weed, if they use cannabis. And everyone has a bit of a different approach. I'm curious how you would approach that.
Yeah, sure. So I am a very transparent person, or I try to be. So I definitely would say, yeah, I have consumed cannabis before, and I've definitely seen the ways in which it can be a double-edged sword. I've experienced the positives and the negatives. So I feel that I am in a good position to be speaking with you about harm reduction. That's probably what I would say. I know, it's going to depend on the audience that you're speaking with. Perhaps you are changing your answer time by time, depending on, the energy in the room, that sort of thing. But I would be honest as much as possible. If you can say that. If you don't want to say that, you don't have to. I would read the room. But in terms of my personal response, I would reply as such.
People don't have to have lived experience, but it definitely provides a special type of value, as long as it's not, glorifying the use, of course. In the beginning of the workshop, we want to meet them where they're at and come from a place of understanding. And now we're moving into talking about how their perception of being a better driver isn't quite accurate. I feel nervous in shifting the tone here. So I guess my question, Sarah, is that how can I tell them this information, still using harm reduction and, telling them in the best way possible?
Yeah, one way that I would approach that, particularly in the question regarding to the scenario regarding to cannabis impaired driving and the person who's driven high a million times, if they're saying that they think that they're a better driver when impaired, I would say, yeah, I can see how you would think that. This is what happens to your body when you consume cannabis. It's no wonder you feel that way and think that way. But to the contrary, this is actually what's happening. These are the statistics. These are the crash, statistics. This is what's happening to your body during this time. I definitely, I agree. We want to meet them where they're at. Where possible, we want to, validate them and make them feel heard, but we do want to be, making sure that we're getting our point across and we are the message that's being remembered.
I have a question as well. Just for the scenario, just because I know of a couple youth that cannabis use is very normal within their family dynamic. And so they don't really see it as I don't even know, as a drug. They see it as something that's very normal. And so sometimes you're confronting different dynamics with youth and their comfort level with cannabis. And so I have a hard time sometimes telling those students the harms and like the negative effects of cannabis because their parents may be using, they have people that they respect that partake in it, and so they don't really see it as negative. And so having that conversation sometimes can be tough, and there's some more pushback just because they haven't seen negative effects within their family.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that, that's tricky. That's similar to the person who's been pulled over by law enforcement and has gotten away with it every time. There's going to be that person who consumes and does get behind the wheel, or people who have cannabis as a more sort of normal aspect of their lives, using it more, as a day-to-day substance versus a drug that impairs you. And we have to obviously be respectful of everyone's lived experience. We can't, speak to the way in which somebody's health is affected by their use of medical cannabis, right? Somebody who goes to work every day might only be able to go to work every day because they're able to have their medical prescription, right? So I think that we don't want to be, it's tricky. It's a fine line. It's what you said, right? We want to be providing them with information, but we also don't want to be, attacking them or putting them on the spot or discrediting their lived experience. So all you can do in that situation is present them with facts, present them with the statistics that you have, with what cannabis is doing in terms of how it does impair you. And, they're going to be able to make that decision themselves based on what they do. If they're going to go and communicate that information to the people in their lives, then even better, right?
Thank you. Yeah, that works.
Perfect.
Thanks for answering my question earlier, Sarah. Yeah, that really helps.
Perfect. No worries. Okay, so Do we have any other last minute questions? I do have that quiz for you guys that I know you're all very excited to complete. Okay. So you should have your pen and paper with you. Now is the time to use it. Here we go. Okay. So the first one, talking to youth about cannabis will increase the chances of them experimenting with it. True or false?
False.
False, yes.
False.
False. Great work. Okay, number 2. People deserve compassion, health, and safety, regardless of substance use.
True.
True. Yeah.
True.
That's such an interesting one, Sarah, because I feel like so many times people look at people with substance use issues as if they need punishment or something like that. So it's such an important one.
Well, it really does go back to the whole idea of in groups and out groups, right? If you're somebody who has never consumed a substance in your life, then somebody who regularly does is going to be in an out group. You don't have any idea how to react to them. You don't have any idea how to relate to them. Yeah, but we need to
Yeah,
be
totally.
Yeah.
Well, and it's so true too that I'll just say it like this, that people who smoke only marijuana and they don't drink, they become snobs then. Oh, we're better because you know, we're only smoking and it's good for our health, and you know, so it's just weird to hear that.
Absolutely.
people
Yeah,
have
even within
feelings,
people who
yeah.
use, there's biases.
Definitely, drinkers feel better than smokers, smokers feel better than drinkers.
Absolutely.
That's so true. Yeah.
Right? Perfect. Okay, 3. It is possible for youth to have a positive experience with cannabis.
True.
True.
Scared to say true.
Yeah, true.
True. And pardon my extra little 4 there. That escaped me. Okay, yes. So it is possible for youth to have a positive experience with cannabis. Number 4. It is my responsibility to provide a definitive answer to each question posed by the audience.
False.
What is
Yeah,
that?
false. Yeah, we can't be expected to have all the answers.
And a definitive one
Hopefully.
to everything? No.
Hopefully.
We only know what we know, right? And we don't want to be speaking about something in an uninformed way. So even a great example of this earlier when I was asked about smoking versus vaping, I didn't have that knowledge to pull right out of my head. And it's okay to say that because you're able to go ahead and source that information later and really be able to provide accurate information. Okay. Number 5, cannabis use can be a form of harm reduction.
True.
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 Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's very, very important that, you know, cannabis is an alternative for pain relief, right? We want to give people options for their pain relief and as much as possible, move away from opioid prescriptions. All right, well, 5 for 5. We have a couple more. All right, number 6. The majority of youth purchase cannabis through a legal source.
True.
False.
I mean, false, sorry.
Is that changing now? Like, I guess it used to be false, but now with legalization, like, are youth going through their older siblings?
That's a
I don't know, just to be different, I'll say the opposite.
Yeah, no, I'm referring to the stat that we pulled a little bit earlier. So 52% of people between the ages of, I believe, 14 to 24 are purchasing from a legal source. So, you know, we do know the majority are purchasing cannabis that is not regulated.
I guess even if they're getting it from a sibling too, it would be illegal technically, right?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
if they're not of age. Mhm.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. Number 7. Social determinants of health would not affect someone's likelihood to use.
false?
False.
False?
I knew what I was doing here with my deliberate wording. When you throw in a not in there and it's a true or false question, it really messes with people. But yeah, we know that social determinants of health, they do affect somebody's likelihood to use. It increases their likelihood to use, and it also, it increases their it decreases their resilience or ability to deal with or capacity to deal with the harms associated with substance use. Okay. Number 8. Cannabis products high in THC and low in CBD are a less risky option for consumption.
True.
True.
I'm giving them all away because I keep
Wait,
seeing my
false.
screen.
Low in THC and high in CBD.
Yeah, Sylvia, you got it. So
That was the other way.
yeah.
Oh, so it's false then.
So as much as possible, we do want to be encouraging youth to use products that have a higher percentage of CBD to THC. And like I said before, if that means making a little cocktail up with a little mix of both, then we can encourage that as well. Okay. Number 9. What are 3 harm reduction interventions for cannabis use?
Um, 3 harm reduction.
When you say interventions, do you
Yeah.
mean like approaches like compassion, meeting them where they're at, like those things?
So this would be more referring to those 10 strategies outlined by CAMH that we went through. So there are 10 you can choose from.
Oh, goodness. Okay. There was.
Desiree, this is all you. I forgot.
And my brain is trying so hard right now.
Like, is it like
Come back to me.
is it like the I love you, I just want to make sure you're safe type thing?
Yeah,
Is that
I mean,
what we're talking
that
about?
works too. Those are definitely, tools that are going to help reduce the harms associated with cannabis use, especially cannabis impaired driving. But really what I was getting at here were more that, we want to be mindful of if we are, our family history, our profile, we want to be mindful
Oh, yes.
pregnant, if we have family history, that sort of thing. We want to
Okay.
ensure that we, again, are using products that are higher in CBD and lower in THC, those sort of things. So those are the 10 strategies outlined by CAMH. Okay, so I would encourage you to go back and revisit those because those are all very, very helpful.
Will do. Because when
Yeah.
you said it, I was like, aha, but it
Yeah.
didn't come that way.
I know. No, it's good, right? This is why we have the quiz, to test your knowledge. All right, so number 10. What does it mean to facilitate through a harm reduction lens?
Non-judgmental, creating safe space. Everybody's entitled to their own thoughts or whatever, I guess.
Yeah.
Focusing more on letting them just know the information and providing them with as much as we can to help them make a good decision. Kind of not push them more towards, but allow them to make the decision if they want to use or not to use with as much information as we can give them. It's kind of what
I would say like
The umbrella.
yeah, and focusing really on like the safer alternatives, like if you choose to use edibles, make sure it has low THC, like, and all that, give them all the scenarios and then how to make it safer.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're presenting information in a way that is neither pro or con cannabis. We're not asking people to, really justify how they know what they know, and we're meeting people where they're at, right? We're knowing that everybody has different lived experiences and everybody is going to be receiving the information that you're providing differently.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, last 5. Number 11, discuss the relationship between abstinence and harm reduction.
The relationship between the two.
Can I go?
I think,
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
So this one's funny because I initially wanted to be like, there's no relationship, none at all. Like this is, harm reduction does not speak abstinence or about it. But then I've also heard like alternatives about like how there are some youth out there who do practice abstinence and like welcoming their ideas and opinions as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess because I guess that's part of harm reduction, we want to just be open to like all opinions and beliefs.
Absolutely.
I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because that is sort of the gut response. There is no relationship. Abstinence, harm reduction, two different things. But the reality of the matter is that abstinence can be a harm reduction intervention, right? Abstinence is not required for people to receive treatment if they are using substances. We are not, having that assumed morality in abstinence and substance use and punishment or fear. So the relationship is definitely, it's definitely an interesting one, but they do work hand in hand because we do want to, acknowledge people who are everywhere on the spectrum. There's people who are going to be using every day and there's people who have never used at all. We can present them information to reduce harms to them regardless. Okay.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because I have facilitated in classes before where there's been youth who are practicing abstinence and they don't feel like heard enough. And I think you worded it in a great way, saying that like it is a form of harm reduction. It's just not the only way.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Sylvia. Okay, number 12. What are the benefits of harm reduction methods to the direct community?
More knowledge.
Okay,
like people are more informed.
And with the driving impaired part of it, it impacts people losing family members, accidents and kind of the loss of the community's loss level, it reduces that.
I love that. Thank you for bringing that up. That's something that I don't think I even really touched upon. And that wasn't even what I was considering with my response to this question, but you're absolutely right. We are reducing, the loss and the grief of the community by saving lives.
Yeah.
What I was getting at here, so the benefits of harm reduction methods to the direct community is that harm reduction believes that the people who use drugs and who use substances should be, having a say in the policies and resources that they're accessing. So the benefits of harm reduction are to the direct community are immensible. You can't put a label on how beneficial it is, and it's going to look different depending on what community you're in. We also know that because these resources are developed in part by the people who are accessing them, they are then sharing this information and these resources with other people within their in-group who could benefit from that information. So it's really, increasing resiliency, increasing support of the community itself, and really, benefiting the community as a whole. Okay.
Yeah, I guess reducing impaired driving deaths is our main goal.
Yes, that is our main
I feel
goal
like
here.
in this whole specific conversation, we kind of lost sight of that until Desiree brought it up.
That was I thought I answered it wrong. My bad.
No, there's no wrong answer because that's, again, a definite benefit of harm reduction. And the whole purpose is against cannabis impaired driving. So no, that's wonderful. Okay. 13. What is implicit bias and how may it express itself through facilitation of a workshop?
It's like your unintended bias showing through, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you got
Yeah.
it.
So like I could do this workshop and understand the value of harm reduction and why I should do this, but if I have, you know, my own personal really strong beliefs, you know, because maybe my personal experience of seeing, you know, drug abuse or being affected by impaired drivers, I have these personal biases that are just going to overshadow, you know, the way I communicate.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's a big risk we have, you know, with people facilitating is when those show through
Absolutely.
and it
Mhm.
becomes detrimental in the workshop.
Mm-hmm. It goes back to really maintaining that neutrality and being able to present information in a way that is neither pro or con. We're just giving you the facts, and you're going to be able to make your own, you know, autonomous decision based on the information I'm giving you. Um, so the way that it is, you know, typically expressed a lot of the time is through language. So particularly when we are talking about cannabis use, if we have somebody using stoner, burnout, those sort of terms, then you're communicating that you know, are anti-cannabis, whether or not you mean to in that moment or not.
Mhm.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, 14. How will the circle of trust activity inform your future facilitation?
I think it would kind of open your eyes to the possible biases that you hold, just so that you're more aware when you're entering those spaces that you have your version of your experience, and the people around you seem to have a similar experience, so you don't really know everything is kind of what it would bring me into the facilitator situation with, and just kind of keep me more open to everyone's experiences, just because I've identified that the people I know seem to have very similar ones.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's great.
I think it's just nice to have that dynamic in the room of everyone sharing and it not being a time in the workshop when you're just like spewing out information to youth. It's very, feels like everyone's on the same level.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Okay, and last but certainly not least, discuss your role as a facilitator and the responsibility you hold to facilitate in an inclusive, anti-oppressive manner.
I guess I see my job as a facilitator as making sure that they have the knowledge given to them in the best possible way, in a way that has no harm. And so whatever I can do to provide that education, you know, obviously with the end goal, but provide that education in the most effective and, you know, way that, yeah, has the least harm.
Absolutely. Does anybody else want to share?
I don't do facilitating training. I don't do that, unfortunately, but I think in regards to like responsibility that I think it holds, it's just because you have the power to possibly educate someone to making a shift in their life, right? Like a permanent shift in one of their habits, because now they kind of understand why they should make that change. And so the responsibility is like what Sylvia said, just making sure you're kind of setting up the space and you're giving them the information that they need, and you're just allowing them to have a place to learn safely. And hopefully they leave wanting to change their habits or shift habits or make better decisions. Yeah, that they use it in their everyday life is kind of the responsibilities that you have them leave with using something they learned.
Yeah, for sure. I love that. I think it's important too when we do consider our role as facilitator to really know that you are walking into a space with this assumed authority on the matter. And so just being open to, you know, people who are raising their hands and sharing their different experiences, people outside of your in-group who are going to have different stories to tell. We want to, of course, be able to hold space for those as well. Okay. Well, do we have any last minute comments, questions, concerns, anything like that?
I just have a thank you.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. I don't have any final questions. I don't know if Larissa does, but Yeah, I thought it was great. And I feel like you answered any questions I didn't even know I had.
Oh,
Yeah.
amazing. Okay, well, perfect. So just so that we're going over them all, these were my references that I did use, lots of good ones. If there's one website that I would encourage you to check out, it would be the Harm Reduction Coalition page. They go over everything so well and break it down so well. They have lovely infographics as well. So they've been one of my favorite harm reduction resources. Second page of references. And then this is me. So I am Sarah Bell, but I do have my sort of side business, Cerebellum Services, which is a nice play on words. But I do, yeah.
So cool.
Thank you. I do facilitate all sorts of different workshops. So anybody who, has a contact that need something worked on, content delivered, curriculum developed, I'm your girl. So I can be reached at cerebellumservices@gmail.com, or you can find me on LinkedIn.